The Emancipation Proclamation had been signed. The war was over. Slavery, on paper, was gone. But in East Texas, freedom was a word that lived in ink, not in flesh. Out in the cotton fields, chains had simply been replaced by contracts. Whips by sheriffs. Masters by landlords who smiled at the law while twisting it like a knife. They called the land Tres Montañas, though there were no mountains, just 3 wide mounds of dirt rising like graves under the blistering sun. The name came from a story whispered in the quarters. 3 enslaved men once tried to run. They were caught, buried alive up to their necks, and left for the vultures. The land remembered, even when people were forced to forget. It was here in 1877, 12 years after freedom, that Caleb was born. His mother, Miriam, worked the rows until her fingers bled raw. His father, Isaiah, had once been a blacksmith, strong enough to shape iron, but now shoveled waste for pennies and a place to sleep near the mule pens. They were called laborers. In truth, they were prisoners on land they did not own, bound not by chains but by hunger, debt, and lawmen who knew exactly where to aim their rifles. Miriam never once told her son that he was free. "Freedom don't mean nothing if your child still eats from a pig's bucket," she would mutter, sweat dripping down her back as she bent into the rows. For her, survival was the only measure of liberty. The community carried scars that the law refused to see. Men who questioned wages disappeared. Women dragged to the big house at night returned with eyes that never looked the same. Children who spoke too boldly were beaten until silence was their only language. Every family carried a story. Most were buried in whispers. And in the middle of this quiet war stood the fig tree. Its branches stretched over the quarters like a judge watching from the gallows. To white overseers, it was just another tree. To the black workers, it was something else entirely. It remembered. It held every lash, every name, every cry swallowed by the earth. And Caleb, even as a boy, seemed to feel its weight. He was quiet, too quiet. Other children shouted, played, wept when punished. Caleb didn't. At 7 years old, he spilled boiling water on his arm. His skin blistered and peeled. He did not scream. He simply stared, wide-eyed, storing something away. The elders said he was touched by spirits. Others said cursed. His father worried. "Boy, if they think you dumb, they'll treat you worse," Isaiah warned. But Caleb's silence was not emptiness. It was gathering. He was saving every sound, every hurt, like kindling waiting for the spark. The land was a cage that pretended to be open, a place where the law itself was the whip. And in that cage, a child named Caleb was already learning that silence could be sharper than steel. From the moment Caleb could walk, silence followed him like a shadow. He didn't babble like other children, didn't cry at night, didn't ask questions. His world was a world without sound, at least not sound that came from him. At first, Miriam thought something was wrong with her boy. She would hold him close, hum lullabies into his ear, whisper prayers over his head. But his eyes, those wide, steady eyes, told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't broken. He was watching, listening, absorbing. Isaiah, his father, worried differently. A man who had once forged iron for Confederate cannons knew what silence could mean on a plantation. "Boy, you keep quiet, they'll take you for dumb. Dumb boys don't last long." He tried to coax words out of Caleb. He told him stories of freedom riders, of nights spent sharpening iron into tools. But Caleb only stared, unblinking. What nobody understood was that Caleb's silence was not weakness. It was armor. Every cry he swallowed, every word he refused, every scream he buried, that silence grew heavier, sharper, like a blade being forged in secret. He saw things other children should never see. Men beaten until their shadows disappeared from the rows forever. Girls dragged into barns and returned days later with eyes gone hollow. Old folks collapsing in the fields while overseers laughed that freedom meant dying under the same sun as before. Caleb saw it all, and with each wound carved into the world, he added another layer of silence inside himself. Then came the night that silence hardened into stone. Isaiah had been accused of stealing a saddle. No jury, no trial, just two men with badges and a lie. They dragged him away under the glow of a lantern, Miriam clutching Caleb to her chest as if her arms could shield him from the truth. 3 weeks later, Isaiah came back in a box. His body broken, his hands missing. A man who had once shaped iron now returned without the tools that defined him. Miriam did not scream.
She did not weep.
She walked to the fig tree, collapsed at its roots, and sang one word over and over. Name.
Name.
Name. Because Isaiah's name would be erased from records, buried without a marker, forgotten by law. But Miriam refused to let it vanish from the earth. Caleb stood beside her, tiny hands pressed against the tree's bark. That night, he picked up a nail, dull and rusted, and carved his father's name into the trunk. The wood bled sap. Caleb's silence deepened, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with names. The boy who never spoke had found his first congregation, a tree that remembered. And with each new loss, each disappearance, Caleb's silence grew heavier. Until one day, silence would no longer be enough. They called it the season of silence. 3 people vanished in just 1 week, and no one dared speak of it too loudly. It started with old Benny, a man whose back was bent but whose voice once carried hope like lantern light. He had been a teacher in secret, sharing words by candle glow, reminding others that knowledge was the only true escape. Then one night he was gone. Only his hat remained, stiff with sweat, lying near the gears of the mill, stained with blood. Soon after, Josie May disappeared. She was 15, full of laughter, quick on her feet, and quicker with a joke. She fetched water from the well one evening and never returned. The bucket was found the next morning at the treeline. Her footprints stopped where the dirt turned to shadows. The last was Eli, a boy no older than 9. He had been too polite, too eager to please. A foreman slapped him for speaking out of turn. By dawn, his bed was empty. No trail, no body. Just absence. Each disappearance pressed down on the quarters like a storm cloud. Mothers held their children tighter. Fathers walked with heads bowed, whispering prayers to a God who seemed to have turned his face away. Fear was everywhere, thick, heavy, choking. But Caleb? He carried that fear to the fig tree. Under its twisted branches, he began a ritual. With a rusted nail, he carved the missing names into its bark. Benny, Josie, Eli. Each stroke split the wood, and each line of sap that trickled out felt like blood. He pressed his hand against the bark, feeling its pulse, as though the tree itself remembered. Night after night, more names joined them. Marcus, Little Joe. Workers gone without explanation, swallowed by silence. Caleb's hands grew calloused from carving, but he never stopped. The fig tree became his altar. Every cut into its flesh was a refusal to let memory die. And then came the rope. He carried it first as practice, testing knots, pulling branches, measuring strength. The overseers never noticed. To them, Caleb was just another quiet labor. But to those who watched him walk barefoot under the moonlight, rope slung over his shoulder, he looked like something more. A shadow of justice, moving silently across fields of white cotton. When Aunt Ruth was beaten nearly to death by men with badges, Caleb sat by her side. She whispered one word. Why? Caleb had no answer. But inside, he made a vow. If the land could erase names, then he would write new ones in memory and in flesh. The fig tree would not just remember. It would bear witness. And soon, the overseers would understand that silence could strike back. The summer heat pressed down like a punishment. Days bled together in sweat and dust, the cotton rows stretching endlessly beneath a merciless sun. Whips cracked less often now, not out of mercy, but out of fear. The workers whispered of the fig tree and of Caleb, though he never spoke a word. Something was building. Then came Silas Breck. He was the cruelest of them all, an overseer who seemed to breathe violence. Silas carried the whip like it was scripture. He made men kneel on gravel before lashing them, quoting verses he invented, twisting the Bible into a weapon. He laughed at pain, spat at mothers, and called it discipline. To Silas, cruelty wasn't a duty, it was entertainment. But one dawn, Silas Breck was found dangling from the fig tree. His body swayed gently, his tongue split purple, his boots kicking at air that offered no mercy. Pinned to his chest was a torn page from a Bible. Written in rough, blotched ink were the words, "For they have sown the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind." Hosea 8 verse 7. The workers gathered slowly. No one screamed. No one touched him. Some covered their mouths. Others fell to their knees, not in grief, but in awe. For the first time in living memory, an overseer's punishment had come not from God, not from law, but from the land itself. And from Caleb. He stood a few feet from the tree, barefoot, chest bare, eyes low. Sheriff Duncan rode in soon after, sweat beading his neck, pistol at his side. He spat at the dirt and called Silas a fool who got himself killed. But no one believed him. When he turned to Caleb, silent, towering, unflinching, he asked, "You hear anything last night, boy?"
Caleb said nothing.
Just stared. The sheriff's smile twitched. He cursed under his breath and rode away. The silence was heavier than any answer. That evening, whispers spread like wildfire. Some said spirits had returned to protect the people. Others claimed old root magic had risen again. A few whispered Isaiah, Caleb's father, had risen from the grave to finish what had been stolen from him. But most eyes fell on Caleb, the quiet man who never spoke, who carried a rope on his shoulder like scripture. The fig tree had given its first sermon. And the workers understood. This was not rebellion, not chaos. This was balance. A ledger being rewritten. A land that refused to forget. Caleb's silence was no longer just his own. It was the voice of the voiceless, a thunder without sound. And with the first rope pulled tight around Silas Breck's neck, the world of Tres Montañas would never be the same again. After Silas Breck swung from the fig tree, the air around Tres Montañas changed. The cotton still grew, the sun still burned, but something in the land itself felt different. Overseers walked with jittery eyes, deputies rode in pairs instead of alone, and every worker moved as if waiting for the next verse of an unfinished sermon. Caleb had not spoken again.
He didn't need to.
His silence now carried the weight of prophecy. The workers began to follow his rhythm without even realizing it. When Caleb paused in the rows, they paused. When he lifted a man who had collapsed from heat, they stood straighter, braver. When he stood guard outside a woman's cabin after she returned from the big house, no one dared approach. He had become more than a man. He was presence itself. Hammond, the new overseer, tried to carry on as if nothing had changed. He barked orders, cracked his whip, and called Caleb a mute fool. But his voice trembled when shadows crossed his path, and his whip always hesitated when Caleb's eyes locked with his. The fields, once ruled by the overseer's commands, now answered to silence. One hot afternoon, Hammond made his mistake. Samuel, a boy of 13, was picking slowly. His hands were torn open from infected cuts. Cotton spilled from his basket. Hammond struck him with the whip, and the boy screamed. Before Hammond could lift the whip again, Caleb moved. He stepped forward, each stride heavy as a drumbeat. He carried no weapon, no words, just presence. Hammond froze. The whip quivered in his grip, then fell limp at his side. The boy was carried to shade, cradled in Caleb's arms. The workers said nothing, but in their silence, they understood. Caleb was no longer simply a man. He was their protector, their preacher, their scripture. 2 nights later, Hammond vanished. By dawn, his body dangled from the fig tree. No verse this time, no explanation. Only his pistol tucked into his waistband, his face slack in death. The workers gathered again. This time, they did not stare in shock. They nodded. They whispered prayers. They recognized the pattern forming. Each overseer who raised his hand against them now lived under the shadow of that tree. Caleb never claimed the role. He never raised a hand in the open or demanded a word of loyalty. But his silence was enough. His rope was enough. The fig tree had become the pulpit, and Caleb, without voice, without Bible, was the preacher. And the sermons had only just begun. The first light of dawn barely touched the cotton fields when they found him. His name was Harlan Griggs, an overseer known for cruelty that even other cruel men whispered about. Now he hung 10 feet above the ground, boots swaying gently, his body twisting in rhythm with the morning breeze. The tree that held him wasn't just any tree. It was old, gnarled, and heavy-limbed, a fig tree that had watched generations suffer in its shade. It had heard the crack of whips, the cries of children, and the bitter songs of mothers. But this morning it held something different. It held judgment. The crowd gathered slowly. Men, women, children, faces marked with dust, sweat, and something heavier, memory. Nobody screamed. Nobody wept. Silence fell across the field, a silence thick enough to choke on. To some it was justice. To others it was warning. Pinned to Griggs's chest was a torn scrap of paper. On it, a verse written in shaky but deliberate hand. For they have sown the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. The words fluttered with the morning air, a sermon carried by the wind. Then he appeared. From the far end of the rows, a tall, broad-shouldered figure walked barefoot through the cotton. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if every footfall was pulled downward by the weight of the past. His skin was dark, his shirt worn, his silence louder than any whip that had ever cracked in those fields.
Caleb.
For 30 years, this man had spoken no words. Not as a child when his mother was dragged away. Not when his father's body came back in a coffin, hands missing. Not when neighbors disappeared one by one into the night. He had lived his entire life in silence, collecting every wound, every scream, every name, and storing them somewhere deep inside. Now, standing before the body of Harlan Griggs, Caleb finally broke that silence. He opened his mouth, and with a voice that sounded like thunder trapped in stone, he whispered one word. Witness. That was all. Just one word. But in that instant, the entire field shifted. The black workers fell to their knees, not in fear, but in reverence. The white men who lingered at the edge of the crowd turned pale and hurried away, doors locking behind them. Because they all understood, this was not murder. This was a sermon. The fig tree had become a pulpit. And Caleb, silent for 3 decades, was its preacher. But how did a boy born in bondage, a child who refused to speak, become the man whose rope held 10 overseers? How did silence turn into scripture and grief into justice? To understand the man who preached with a noose, we have to return to the beginning. Before the rope, before the silence, before Caleb became the preacher of the hanging tree. By the time the 3rd and 4th bodies appeared beneath the fig tree, fear was no longer a whisper. It was a storm. Overseers stopped walking the rows alone. Deputies rode by in silence, hands never straying far from their pistols. Even the sheriff's questions grew softer, his threats dulled. The fig tree was no longer just a landmark. It was a courthouse, a gallows, and a pulpit all at once. Its shadow stretched over every white man who dared step onto Trace Montagne's. And Caleb? He was the judge they could not bribe, the preacher they could not silence. Deputy Lyle had been the next. A drunk who liked to terrorize the quarters, he once fired shots over children's heads just for sport. One morning, his horse returned without him, saddles smeared with blood. By noon, they found him nailed to the fig tree, crucified, his badge jammed into his mouth. Behind him, carved into the bark, was a single phrase, false prophet. No one doubted who had delivered the verdict. And yet, no one spoke Caleb's name aloud. He didn't have to be mentioned. His presence was enough. Foreman Trent followed soon after, found dangling upside down from the rafters like a slaughtered hog, molasses smeared across his face to draw the ants. The message was clear. Cruelty would be answered, ledger by ledger. Whispers spread beyond the plantation. In nearby towns, white landowners muttered over whiskey glasses, debating whether to call in marshals or militias. Some argued Caleb was just a ghost story, an invention to keep workers brave. But those who had seen his silence, Those who had stood in his shadow knew better. Among the black workers, silence became prayer. Children learned to keep their voices low, to walk with steady steps, to mimic the rhythm of Caleb himself. When disputes broke out among them, people whispered, "The rope don't just judge the white man." And for a time, even inside the quarters, balance returned. Violence stopped where Caleb's shadow lingered. For the overseers, though, the fear was unbearable. Every creak of a floorboard, every gust of wind through fig leaves felt like a rope tightening around their throats. Some quit outright, riding away in the dead of night. Others tried to drink their dread into silence, but liquor couldn't wash away the memory of dangling boots. The plantation owner, Colonel Ashcraft, began to hear rumors that Caleb was no longer just a man, but a symbol, that the land itself had chosen him as its mouthpiece, that God now spoke in rope and silence. And when the wind moved through the fig tree, it was hard to argue. Fear had spread like fire, and it showed no sign of burning out. Colonel Thaddeus Ashcraft had survived the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the collapse of his fortune more than once. He was a man who believed he could outlast anything. But he had never faced silence like this, silence that carried names, silence that hung men from trees. At first, he dismissed the killings as coincidence, the work of drunkards or thieves. But as the bodies piled, as every overseer and deputy tied to his land was found swinging or nailed to bark, the colonel's certainty began to crumble. Then came the dreams. He woke soaked in sweat, sheets tangled, the sound of rope creaking echoing through the big house. Sometimes he dreamed of the fig tree inside his bedroom, its branches scraping the ceiling. Other nights, he saw his father's ghost whispering, "Blood ain't inheritance, boy. It's debt." He drank more, brandy at breakfast, whiskey at dusk, laudanum when the nights grew unbearable. But the rope followed him, slithering through his sleep like a serpent. Always 10 ropes. Always one left empty. He tried to fight back. He summoned bounty hunters, men from Houston with rifles and hard eyes. He told them to cut down the root of the problem. By morning, those bounty men were found alive but bound at the fig tree, their mouths gagged, their eyes wide with terror. A note pinned to one chest read, "You were spared. Try again and the rope speaks." They left before noon and never returned. Soon, even his own household began to unravel. Cooks fled. Maids whispered in gullah prayers and refused to go near the West Wing. At night, Ashcraft would pace the halls alone, pistol in one hand, Bible in the other, muttering prayers he didn't believe. And then came the signs he could not explain. A noose laid at the foot of his bed. Words scratched into his mirror. "The fig tree knows your name." He smashed the glass, but the message would not leave his mind. The colonel stopped stepping outside after sundown. He boarded his windows. He ordered his meals brought to him on trays. Yet even in the safety of locked doors, he would see him, Caleb, sometimes in the garden, sometimes at the well, sometimes standing beneath the old slave bell, rope over his shoulder, eyes like stone.
Silent.
Waiting. Ashcraft's pride dissolved into paranoia. He knew the ledger wasn't finished. He knew that 10th rope was waiting. And every night, as he lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, he whispered to himself, "Not me. Not me." But deep down he understood. The land had been keeping score, and the fig tree would not forget his name. The workers gathered in silence that night, their faces lit only by lanterns and the pale glow of the moon. Word had spread quickly. The last name on Caleb's ledger was ready. Not whispered in secret this time, not carried as rumor. The whole quarter knew. The 10th rope was waiting. Nathaniel Greaves. He wasn't a whipcracker in the fields. He was worse. He was the man who smiled while signing false ledgers, who rationed food until bellies growled empty, who decided which children were useful and which could be traded away. And in the shadows, he was the man who dragged women into rooms they never wanted to enter. He had managed the house through slavery and into freedom, a relic of cruelty, wearing the mask of civility. For Caleb, the name was older, sharper. Greaves was the man who had taken his mother. The memory of her torn dress, the sound of her voice screaming his name, those wounds had never healed. And now, with a rope in his hand and the fig tree waiting, Caleb carried her memory like fire. The people followed him, not as a mob but as a congregation. There were no chants, no torches, only the sound of footsteps in dirt. Greaves opened his door to find them standing in silence. At their head, Caleb, rope over one shoulder, his mother's faded dress in the other hand. Greaves laughed at first, a shallow, brittle laugh. That was years ago. None of you can prove. His words died when Caleb dropped the dress at his feet. The crowd closed in, slow and steady, like water rising around a drowning man. They bound his hands, not with cruelty, but with ritual. He was led to the fig tree, where so many had swung before him. Caleb tied the knot himself, his fingers steady, his silence absolute. When the moment came, he lifted his head. 30 years of silence broke open with a single word, his second and last sermon. Witness. The crowd stirred. Some wept, others gasped. One word, but it cracked the night open like thunder. It was not revenge.
It was testimony.
It was memory carved into air, binding the past to the present. The rope tightened. Greaves struggled, his feet kicking against nothing. The branch held firm, and as his body swayed, the people bowed their heads. No cheers, no cries. Only solemn reverence. 10 ropes. 10 names. 1 tree. And for the first time since his childhood, Caleb wept. Tears slid silently down his face as his mother's name, carved years before, seemed to glow in the bark beneath his hand. The fig tree had spoken its last sermon, and the land, at last, had balance. The morning after the 10th rope dropped, Tres Montañas was transformed. The air was still, heavy, as if the land itself held its breath. No overseers barked orders. No sheriff's boots echoed through the quarters. Even the wind seemed to pause in the branches of the fig tree. The people gathered at its roots, not in fear, but in ceremony. They brought offerings, broken tools, worn shoes, scraps of cloth from whipping posts. Some laid flowers, others laid stones carved with names of the lost. For the first time, the ground where they stood felt less like a prison and more like holy land. Caleb sat beneath the tree, rope coiled at his side. He wasn't the same man who had once walked silently among the rows, his silence mistaken for emptiness. Now his silence was understood. It was not the silence of submission. It was the silence of judgment, of memory, of justice fulfilled. Colonel Ashcraft watched from the window of his big house, gaunt and trembling. He tried to rise, but his legs gave way. For the first time, the colonel felt the eyes of the land on him. Not Caleb's eyes, not even the workers, but the weight of history itself. Later that day, he left the plantation for good. No cane, no hat, no words. Just a broken man walking out of his own empire, never to return. Life at Tres Montañas began to change. The fields were still there, but they were no longer soaked with the same dread. The quarters slowly became homes. Children learned to read and write. The chapel became less about forgiveness and more about remembrance. And once a year, the people gathered at the fig tree, not to mourn, but to honor. Stones piled at its roots, each one carrying a name, each one a reminder that silence no longer erased the past. Caleb lived many more years. He never left the land. He never took another life. He never spoke again. After that final word, witness, he seemed to have said all he ever needed. When he died in his sleep, they buried him beneath the fig tree. No headstone, just a rope coiled into the roots and a single carving left in the bark. Justice. Today, if you walk that field, the fig tree still stands older, twisted, its bark thick with scars. The names carved into it have faded, but if the wind is just right, some say you can hear it. The creak of a branch, the hush of a crowd, the whisper of sermons older than any church. Caleb's silence speaks still, not through words, but through memory, through the tree, through the people who remember, that even in a land where freedom was stolen, justice could still find its way, one rope at a time.